Thank you for choosing to listen to PhoenixFire today. PhoenixFire features John Anthony West. You can access the PhoenixFire blog at www.jawphoenixfire.blogspot.com. You can learn more about John Anthony West by going to www.jawest.net.
PhoenixFire. PhoenixFire number 7.
This is PhoenixFire, John Anthony West, rogue Egyptologist and mystic in skeptics' clothing, broadcasting from West Henge in the wilderness with something to offend everyone. Welcome to the conflagration.
PhoenixFire would like to apologize for the audio quality of this podcast. We were under attack from the Skype gremlins. Anyway, we've managed to clean it up as best we could, and we hope it doesn't impair your enjoyment of it too much. And now, here is John Anthony West.
Hello, everyone. It's John Anthony West from West Henge in the wilderness with PhoenixFire number 7. Atlantis here, Atlantis there, Atlantis damn near everywhere. In this program, we will be looking into what my colleague Robert Schock and myself call the A word, and we will analyze the A word in some depth. But meanwhile, first, a bit of an apology. A number of you have emailed in because it's been quite a while since the last installment of PhoenixFire 6, wondering what had happened, had we abandoned it. It is entirely my fault, but in part, that fault is genetic. I seem to be one of these individuals, rare, born with 2 Achilles heels, and both of them, I'm afraid, are organization. Beyond that, been very, very busy. Beyond that, we gave up on our original format with Galactic 7 Radio, which required a program every couple of weeks, and they weren't doing much for us, so we just parted company. But the upsides of being held to that 2-week deadline was that I actually got it done, whereas left to my own non-deadline, as you see, months elapse between episodes or between programs. I'm hoping it won't be like this from now on in, but it won't be bi-weekly. As promised, I will have to change that little blurb on the blog actually to read as and when West gets around to doing his own show. Something of that sort. In any event, I'm back with you now, and we'll be discussing the Atlantis myth as it comes to us from Plato, and then I'll be talking about, in some depth, the various candidates for Atlantis, for the sighting of the geographical Atlantis, and you will be, unless you're an Atlantologist yourself, you will be amazed at the number of candidates there are for this lost civilization. Some of them have more or some of them less credibility, and then we will go into a very important book that is practically unknown, and this book really should, it doesn't because it's so unknown, but it really should put a different slant on the hunt for Atlantis once and for all. But the first third of our program will be more or less historical and, as I said, an overview of the various candidates for Atlantis. So, okay, let's start off with that. Atlantis, the A word, a brief history. It really starts with this remarkable man, Ignatius Donnelly, politician, big-time politician, author, novelist, explorer, amazing 19th century character who in 1888 wrote a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which was an enormous work of scholarship, 500-600 pages, and believe it or not, it's a book that has never been out of print since 1888. It was a big bestseller in its day, and that set off, let's say, the entire hunt for Atlantis as a geographical location. Donnelly drawing his cue from Plato, who seems to place it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And though he couldn't demonstrate that there was an Atlantis in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the 400 or 500 pages of his book were devoted to a collection of evidence of relationships between Old and New World, of all kinds of zoological and biological similarities between both sides and both continents, as it were, on East and West. And the evidence that he collected was pretty impressive, and that's one of the reasons why the book is still in print, because even if a lot of the material doesn't necessarily check out following modern research, there's enough there, even today, to say, well, this is something that really should be taken quite seriously. And so Donnelly started this whole thing off. It's been going strong ever since. Interestingly enough, one of the early Atlantologists was a man now not much known called William Fairfield Warren, who was a theologian, and he was the head of the Methodist School of Theology in Boston, which subsequently became, through his own efforts, Boston University, which is where my colleague Robert Schoch works, of course. And Warren was another very erudite and very prolific scholar who wrote a book that called Paradise Found, not exactly Atlantis that he was talking about, but in which he postulates that the Garden of Eden, all of these references to a golden age, pertain to a civilization that had once existed in what is now the Arctic Circle, but which was not in former times, according to Warren, the Arctic Circle, but was effectively a paradisiacal land prototype for the Garden of Eden. And I find it sort of amusing, actually, that the founder or the first president of Boston University was actually, in his own way, an Atlantologist. And it's been going strong ever since, and the hunt has been actually heating up over the last 50 years, in part inspired by Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, who in trance state came up with a tremendous amount of information, or purported information. You might say even a scenario that would make, even today, would make, whether true or not, a very interesting screenplay. And so Atlantis has been going strong ever since in the public imagination. And it's one of those interesting things, that certain things that fire the public imagination is not necessarily a sign that the truth is hidden there, or a sign of the public's perspicacity. After all, American Idol fires the public imagination. It's hard to say anything nice about that show. So public enthusiasm does not necessarily translate into, well, there must be a grain of truth there. Our mystery of the Sphinx is a pretty good sign. If you watch television, I don't. I shut mine off about 4 years ago after 9/11, listening to the rubbish that was being spread around as though it were news. But if you watch television, it's pretty dumbed down. And the general feeling, if you deal with television people, and I know lots of them pretty well, the general feeling is that the public is very, very stupid. And we can say with our own experience, just the mystery of the Sphinx, which had this huge audience and probably over the years has been seen by, probably my estimate is something like 250 million people, not only seen but remembered. When I meet people at a party, or even casually, even all sorts of mechanics, blue-collar people, doesn't matter, and get talking and turn to people, say, what do you do? And I'm a writer. What do you write about? Egypt mostly, blah, blah, blah. And I usually cut the question and answer thing short and say, well, did you ever see a show called Mystery of the Sphinx hosted by Charlton Heston? And they say, oh, yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I remember. You did that. That's really interesting stuff. That was a kind of a watershed, in a way, a watershed event. And it was glitzy, and certainly had a big NBC budget behind it, but it was also solidly scientific. It was not dumbed down, put it that way. And the public was fine with that, and remains fine with it. The public is not as stupid as the television producers like to think it is. Problem is, it's pretty undiscriminating. The public finds it hard to tell the difference between Eric von Daniken and Schwaller de Lubitsch. But nevertheless, if the public is addressed with something intelligent and not too daunting, the geology of the Sphinx is really pretty easy. If you come at the public with cold fusion or quantum mechanics or something of that sort, well, it's rather difficult to communicate that. But something that is solid science, but at the same time, let's say sexy, the public goes for that. They like it just fine. So, into this mix comes UFOs. Everybody's fascinated by that. And all of the subjects that are anathema, let's say, to what I call the Church of Progress. Anything having to do with the supernatural, with ESP, with telepathy, even with alternative medicine, even though half the world gets cured on alternative medicine. Anything that doesn't fit into the Church of Progress, materialistic, rationalistic paradigm is, let's say, fires the public, or the imagination of the public. Reincarnation, life after death. All of these subjects have a real appeal for the public. And in this case, in fact, in most of those cases, there probably is something to it, even if they're sensationalized and not necessarily handled responsibly by the media, especially by television. Something leaks through, and they go for it. Doesn't mean, however, that everything is. As I said, public is, unfortunately, not discriminating, but also not stupid. So the Atlantis myth, or the Atlantis legend, lives on, and it lives on very much alive. Let's say it's a going cottage industry. Even just in the last couple of years, I'll read you off. I've been collecting Atlantis material, keep a file for it on my computer, because one of these days, get back to this somewhere along the line, if we get our geology panel off the ground and we actually prove once and for all, in a way that nobody can really challenge, and the quackademic establishment is beaten into the ground. At a certain point, I intend to write a book with Robert Schoch called Stars and Stones, in which we will talk about the whole history of our Sphinx theory, and into that, of course, an integral part is the Atlantis myth. I've, of course, been keeping a file on Atlantis-related material, and it's interesting just to read off, without even going into, at the moment anyway, later I'll do a bit, but without even going into the details, just the headlines, the file names, the document names actually gives you a good idea of how lively the quest is. And this, of course, is not material that makes it into most mainstream newspapers. Some of it does. Some of it will probably be familiar to you, but just read off, it'll be a selected list. I'll just select as I go through what's most relevant to the Atlantis quest. Just the titles themselves, like newspaper headlines. If you read the front page headlines for, let's say, a couple of weeks from the New York Post, they'll give you one sense of current events, and if you read them from the New York Times, you'll get quite a different sense of current events. But between them all, you'll get some idea of the chaos that we're living in. Start off here. It goes alphabetically, of course, as documents do. Ancient crash, epic wave. Andrew Collins visits Bimini. Are we recreating the Atlantean apocalypse? Atlantis in an Iberian inscription of more than 6,000 years old. Atlantis in Spain. Atlantis in the Black Sea. Atlantis myth. Clue found in Atlantic Ocean floor. Baalbek and its relation to Atlantis. Bimini dispute. Very interesting. Bursting ice dam flooded the ancient ocean. Casey prophecies. Cypress investigation. Cypress. RRV reports. Explorations at Andros discover underwater stone wall. That's in the Caribbean. Greg Little, new discoveries in Bahamas. That derives from the Casey work. Very interesting, actually. Hart, DNA evidence for Atlantis. In past tsunamis, tantalizing clues for future ones. Or future ones. Ireland is Atlantis. Ireland is Atlantis too. J.G. Bennett on Atlantis. Santorini. Linear features. Great Bahama Bank and Bimini Islands. Atlantis off the coast of Cuba. Researchers debate existence of Atlantis, sci-fi channel on Atlantis. Seafloor survey buoys Atlantis claim. The ARE, that's Casey's Foundation, search for Atlantis. The day the Earth fell over. The role of geologists in studying the Bimini Road. Thera eruption, much larger than previously thought. Update on the underwater city off the coast of Cuba. Second one on that. Maybe massive dump, maybe. Updated report on Andros expedition, Bimini Road in Ancient Harbor, when we were gods. No photos, another article. Anyway, just from those headlines, you get some idea of the kind of activity that's been going on in the search for Atlantis. So with that kind of activity, you might say, why must it be the A word? Who called it the A word? Us, me and Shock. Why do we call it the A word? Well, my own, let's say, contribution to this quest is, of course, the serpent in the sky and the whole idea that the Great Sphinx, following Shvala-Delubich's observation, was weathered by water and not by wind and sand. I developed, before meeting Shock, I was cautious enough, I sometimes call myself a mystic in skeptic's clothing, I was cautious enough to recognize that it might not have been a geographical location that Plato was talking about, but rather, let's say, a name applied to a highly sophisticated ancient civilization that disappeared. Even then, I was cautious enough to use inverted quotation marks every time I mentioned Atlantis. I mean, I was quite adamant about this, that I wasn't talking about a lost civilization in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Even so, this was a dirty word to the academic establishment. Reincarnation is a dirty word. Telepathy is a dirty word. UFOs is a dirty word. Crop circles is a dirty word. Anything that they don't already believe in and can't categorically measure becomes a four-letter word to them, even though Atlantis has, well, more, 8 or 9, whatever. And now it's time for what is usually called, if you listen to your radio often enough, these important messages, meaning ads. And in this case, what are we selling on the ads? Me. We're selling my Egypt trips. So listen up, because if you don't listen up, you won't be able to catch the next part of the program. Surprise! Until we find sponsors for our dedicated ad space, it's still John Anthony West, here to tell you about my personally guided magical Egypt tours. There's a fascination about Egypt, a glamour, a romance. On my trips, people tell me they've been dreaming of traveling to Egypt since early childhood. There are other wonderful sacred places in the world, Gothic cathedrals, Mayan pyramids, Islamic mosques, Hindu and Buddhist temples. But there is nothing anywhere that matches the grandeur, power, and perfection of Egypt. Yet unless you see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you've not seen Egypt at all. For it is only the symbolist interpretation developed by the brilliant philosopher, mathematician, and alchemist R.A. Shvala-Delubich that makes sense of the Egyptian experience. Where establishment academics see only a bizarre, architecturally accomplished but still primitive civilization, Shvala saw and proved that it was based upon a profound and sophisticated sacred science, a science of cosmic principles. One wonders how people come back from Egypt and live lives the way they lived them before, wrote Florence Nightingale back in 1850. The answer is, they don't. 2 weeks in Egypt and you will understand the difference, finally, between true civilization and progress. For detailed information, see my website, jawest.net. Click on Magical Egypt Tours. These are one-of-a-kind trips. There is nothing like them.
We find ways to avoid crowds. We meditate in the Great Pyramid. We get into places other people don't get into. The food is great, so are the hotels. The price is remarkably competitive. Just remember, if you don't see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you don't see Egypt at all.
PhoenixFire.
And the PS to that ad, my next trip to Egypt will be on October 23rd, 2007. There are enough people signed on so that it will definitely be flying, but there is space for a few more. So if you have all your ducks in a row and your act together and you'd like to join in on the next Egypt trip, you'll want to do that very quickly. Otherwise, you go to my website, you'll find the schedule coming up. There's another one in December, another in January, another in February. But you can get onto that Egypt trip if you so desire. You'll find full information on my website. That's www.jawest.net. Why is it .net? Because some clown tried to hold me up for $1,500 because he had the domain name of .com. So I said, to hell with you, and changed the website. But it's always nice to put a bad word in for a crook. So anyway, www.jawest.net. Click on Magical Egypt Tours. Full information there. Contact me by email or telephone. I think it's listed on the site. Going to come on the October trip, there's room. So I hope to see someone there. Okay. That said, back to Atlantis. During the break, I had enough time to count up the letters. I wasn't sure of that. Couldn't think quick enough before. And there are 8 letters to Atlantis. So it is twice as virulent as normal 4-letter words. Say Atlantis you, and people absolutely quiver. So anyway, Shock and I discovered very early on that this was not a word to be used in polite academic company, as if such existed. So we call it the A word, and it remains the A word in certain academic circles. I never, let's say, endorsed publicly or privately, either for that matter, that it was an actual physical location. Maybe it was a global civilization, and the name Atlantis was just stuck to it because applied by Plato. And so now it's time, actually, to really to go into the Plato description itself, because what we know of Atlantis, insofar as it can be called knowledge, or let's say in the popular imagination, everything relating to Atlantis is derived from that Plato account. And the Plato account is very detailed and quite long-winded, but I will go into that. I will read passages from the description in the Critias and the Timaeus, the dialogues of Plato that tell that tale. But the odd thing is that it's the only account of this vanished civilization that we have in all of literature. However, and it's very specific to Plato, nothing else matches this. However, what we do have from legends around the world, there's almost no civilization, there's almost no, let's say, traditional, nomadic, settled, tribal people that don't have catastrophe myths written into their mythos, into their mythology. The story of a flood is virtually universal. The story of a golden age is virtually universal. The story of great civilizations that went down under cataclysmic conditions is virtually universal. But the Atlantis myth, as we know it, of this continent that sinks under the sea in a single day, comes only from Plato. This is where it gets both interesting and where the clues are, or the clues may be, for the Atlantis hunters not to be too specific about what they are looking for. Because if you remember that list that I read off, there are a lot of candidates for Atlantis. And if you go into those, some of them are books or sections from books, some of them are articles. What I read off is material that's come up just in the last couple of years. But if you go back into, do your research, even on the internet, of course is not that old, 10, 15 years maybe. But if you go into the internet and look up Atlantis, you will find absolutely millions of reference to Atlantis, highly detailed work. But if you become familiar with the literature, you find that wherever the Atlantis is supposed to be, off the coast of Spain, Ireland, Cypress, the Altiplano of Peru and Bolivia, believe it or not, there are all sorts of candidates for Atlantis, and a lot of very careful research has been done. But all of these candidates have, or all of these researchers have one thing in common, and that is they take Plato at face value as a physical description of this lost continent, and then they find always certain similarities between their candidate, be it Ireland or Spain or Peru or Antarctica or wherever. All of them take what fits the Plato description and either fudge away or ignore that which doesn't. And there's always a lot that doesn't. If the place that they're talking about is circular, well, it's not half again the size of, as Plato says it was, half the size of Libya and Asia combined. If it's up in the Altiplano of Peru, it's very difficult to see how it's a great maritime nation. It has to be fudged around. If it's off the coast of Spain, well, again, size has a lot to do with it. If it's supposed to be the island of Santorini, that blew up in the Mediterranean, well, again, it's a little bit of an island, and it's not 9,000 BC that it blew up. It's 1,500 BC or thereabouts. So the way to fudge around that is to say that Plato didn't know what he was talking about and added an extra zero. What he really meant was 900 years before his time, which would have put it around 1,500 BC. So each of the candidates, you might say, each of the Atlantean candidates have disqualifying factors if Plato's legend is meant to be taken absolutely literally and accurate. And now we get to a very strange situation, because if you look at the Atlantis myth and read it carefully, you'll see that it is terrifically detailed. I mean, it is the rings, the moats are so big, and the bridges are this long and that wide, and there are X number of moats. It's as though somebody were describing an actual physical map, as though you went to MapQuest and pulled up Atlantis and then wrote down everything that you saw there. So if it is accurate, and let's say there are things that not only don't coincide, but that contradict the Plato story, it's very difficult to, let's say, make a case for any of those particular sites. Bimini, the one that was Casey found. Now, mind you, some of this work, actually, they are, in certain cases, they're finding things under the sea, but they don't correspond to not close enough to the Atlantis myth. And so far, anyway, the Bimini site is bearing some promise recently that, depending on how deep it is in the water, if they're finding man-made ruins and they're under 100 feet of water, the chances are that they may be finding actual remnants of society, civilizations that existed before the melting of the last ice age. And that, of course, is the favorite candidate for what inundated Atlantis. According to Plato, it sunk in a single day. Well, that's unlikely. But the paleoclimatologists and the geologists who discuss the quaternary extinctions, when all the mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses died, there was certainly a cataclysm probably around 10,000, 10,500, around that period of time, that set off the melting of the last ice age. Now the favorite, just recently actually, comet strike or an asteroid strike of some sort. Schock deals with this in his very good, let's say, state-of-the-art statement on catastrophe theory, The Voices of the Rocks. And that was written, I forget when, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but before this latest work has been done. So something pretty dramatic happened 10, 11, 12,000 years ago. And the waters all melted, and over the course of a couple of thousand years, in certain cases, quite precipitously, the oceans rose 300 feet, but it wasn't all level. I mean, over long periods of time, they were rising rather gradually, and then in a couple of places or a couple of periods, they rose precipitously. So maybe not in a day, but in certain cases, there were surges, let's say, where something could have been inundated in a very short period of time. But so far, all of those candidates for Atlantis, even when interesting in terms of adding to the notion of buried or drowned civilizations, none of those favored candidates conforms closely enough to Plato's account so that you could say, no, this, Spain, is the Atlantis, or that Bimini is Atlantis, or that Cypress is Atlantis, though all of them have, let's say, share in common that they are evidence of underwater societies, underwater civilizations. So now into this mix comes a very interesting book by a man named Ernest G. McLain, spelled M-C, capital C-L-A-I-N, called The Pythagorean Plato, Prelude to the Song Itself. Now, McLain is if he's still alive, and I'm not sure if he is. If he's alive, he's probably 10 years older than I am, in his 80s somewhere. He is a Sufi, a practicing Sufi, I believe, anyway, a Sufi scholar. Sufism, as you don't know, is the mystical aspect of, or the mystical side of Islam. And he is also a very erudite musicologist. McLain's book analyzes Plato from Plato's account from a musicological point of view. In other words, he doesn't even address the historical aspect, and I'll get into this more a little bit later as to why he doesn't. He simply leaves out the possibility that Atlantis was a real geographical location, and he analyzes not just the Atlantis myth, but all of the political dialogues of Plato as musical allegories for a Platonic audience that was schooled in music, to whom music was a kind of entry into divine cosmology, as indeed it is. This is another matter altogether, but it is actually, in other words, through music, the proportional and numerical and mathematical relationships can be understood that effectively explain our living world to us. So McLain denies that there's any town planning to, as it were, to a physical Atlantis. What we'll do now, actually, is read from Plato's own account and from McLain's analysis of Atlantis as musical allegory. Okay, and this is McLain discussing the myth of air, E-R, from the Republic. The Republic concludes with the tale of a strong man, Air, son of Arminius, full of allusions to numerical, temporal, tonal, and spatial relations. I submit that the, quote, plane of truth from which we start our journey to heaven is the musical proportion 6 is to 8 as 9 is to 12, present in every Platonic construction, that the static model for the planetary system, which Plato will set in motion arithmetically in the Timaeus allegory that follows, is the Dorian tetrachord and its reciprocal constructed to heal the tyrant's suffering, and that Plato's tempering of the solar system correlates with the fundamental issue of musical temperament, dramatized in the marriage and tyrant allegories. The plausibility of this assumption is supported by the preceding mathematical material in the Republic and the subsequent material in Timaeus. End of quote. Quoting from McLain about his own methodology, he says, my work progressed by applying the von Thimas-Levy musical insights to the mathematical foundation provided by Adam, Taylor, and Brumbaugh under the guidance of Sigmund Levari, mentor, friend, and colleague who has participated in my studies from the beginning. The result is a thesis which none of us could have anticipated. Not only are all of Plato's mathematical allegories capable of a musical analysis, one which makes sense out of every step in his arithmetic, But all of his allegories taken together prove to be a unified treatise on the musical scale, so that each one throws light on the others. However, it is perhaps even more remarkable that when the Republic, Timaeus, Critias, and Laws are studied as a group, as a unity, it then proves possible to explain virtually every Platonic mathematical riddle with help from related passages, that is, in Plato's own words. For possibly thousands of years before Plato, music provided a meaningful correspondence between number and tone in the readily observed and easily measured correlations between string lengths on Hindu, Sumerian, Babylonian harps and the tonal intervals they sound. Other factors being equal, having a string length changes its pitch by an octave. The ratio 1 to 2 thus corresponds to an acoustical experience, and the most important one, for every such division by 2 is perceived as a kind of cyclic identity and is assigned the same letter name in modern notation. Subdivisions of this octave space can be defined as smaller ratios, i.e. between successively larger numbers. Although the ear cannot verify results with any accuracy beyond the first subdivisions of the fifth, 2 to 3, fourth, 3 to 4, and perhaps the major third, 4 to 5, and minor third, 5 to 6, yet even micro-intervals can be readily calculated by the number theorist to whatever limits please him by continuing operations with these same first 6 integers, and the tuner can follow, generating each tone from the last one, never daring to omit intermediate steps. End of quote. Here's MacLean again, talking about the implications, political, philosophical implications of Plato's musical allegory. The Republic is concerned with the meaning of justice in the ideal city. But when Socrates, early in the dialogue, describes that kind of city as limited to essentials, to what is necessary, Glaucon, Glaucon, protests its lack of luxuries. To humor him, Socrates expands the discussion to include also the, in quotes, luxurious, feverish city, later to be named Atlantis, doomed to destruction, however, because it is gorged, quote, it is gorged with a bulky mass of things which are not in the cities because of necessity. The mathematical allegory we are about to study concerns not simply the best model, Pythagorean tuning, limited to tones linked arithmetically by powers of 3 and musically by fourths and fifths, but also the worst model, just tuning, idealized but impracticable because its pure thirds, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, are incommensurable with fifths, 2 to 3, and fourths, 3 to 4, giving rise to an internal conflict like that Socrates predicts between rulers and auxiliaries, etc., etc., etc. It's interesting to note, John West speaking again, it's interesting to note that in Ouspensky once defined evil as what is that which is unnecessary. I'm not sure if Ouspensky was referring in any sense or another to Plato, probably not, but interesting that there in the middle of the 20th century we have a modern writer and philosopher using the same fundamental understanding of the deleterious or ultimately the destructive aspects of too much of anything. From MacLean here, a chapter called The Creation of the World Soul from the Timaeus. 1, 2, 3, Socrates counts, opening the Timaeus dialogue with the numbers which generate the world soul. Plato's elaborate introduction to Timaeus begins with a summary of the Republic and continues with a lengthy preview of Critias before Timaeus himself is allowed to speak. Socrates' tale of 2 cities, an ideal city limited to essentials, Pythagorean tuning, and enduring forever in a luxurious city, just tuning, gorged with a bulky mass of things which are not in cities because of necessity, and therefore doomed, has awakened in Critias the memory of a similar tale of 2 cities. He tells of a war fought some 9,000 years ago between ancient Athens and the barbarian city of Atlantis. All the details have come back to him as told originally by a priest of Sais to Solon. MacLean again, commenting upon Critias, for the vivid imagery in the myth of Atlantis, Plato had many possible sources. The circular cities of Ecbatana and Babylon were familiar to Herodotus, 5th century BC. Carthage possessed a circular naval basin an impressive canal system, elephants and springs, just like Atlantis. Moats, triremes, temples, huge armies, and aggressive ambition were ideas familiar to Plato's audience. The interpretation being offered here, however, assumes that Atlantis is Plato's Pythagorean musical comedy, and that its serious function is to promote a deeper level of mathematical analysis of the marriage allegory of the Republic. I shall quote the myth in considerable detail and set its arithmetical elements alongside the facts of Plato's marriage arithmetic, letting the reader discover for himself how much can be learned by this juxtaposition. Such an adventure in musical imagination is without precedent and can appeal to no authority but our own intuition for its verification. Again, MacLean looking into, let's say, into antiquity deeper than the Greeks. In the myth of invariance, that's MacLean's earlier book, I suggest that this calendrical construction belonged to many ancient civilizations thousands of years older than the Greek one. Poseidon is the Greek incarnation of the Sumerian Babylonian Ea Enki, and the sexagesimal arithmetic of that culture could have supplied Plato with his basic material. MacLean, in his chapter called Conclusions, Alfred North Whitehead summarized the history of Western philosophy as essentially a footnote to Plato. But Plato himself, de Nicholas observes, is but a kind of footnote to even more ancient philosophers. With the rise of Aristotelian rationalism and the later emergence of theological dogmatism, Plato's mode of thinking was misunderstood and misrepresented, and with fateful consequences. Plato himself invalidates all efforts to ground dogmatic philosophy on his authority. Thanks to the survival of the whole corpus of his writings, Plato remains the only truly valid or even essential commentary on himself. The vision of the world which he embodied as, quote, a visible living creature, a perceptible God, is the vision we are trying to recapture. Now, MacLean himself isn't actually inventing this idea. This is not an idea out of the blue. He's actually building upon the work of a handful of earlier scholars going back into the 19th century who also understood that behind Plato's description there are musical analogies, musical references, and these are central to the understanding of Plato. If you don't understand that it's music and that it's the relationship between different modes of music, different scales, different Pythagorean mode, and there's a Phrygian mode, and there's a Dorian mode. There are a few of these modes that relate to each other or contrast with each other in very intricate and very interesting ways. And Plato's students would have understood this as easily as somebody explaining a football game or a soccer game or a baseball game to people who were football or baseball or soccer fans. So it would have made perfect sense to them, but unless you're a musicologist, and I am not myself a musicologist, it won't make sense to you. Other than that, it is quite clear that the work is very carefully done and that MacLean does not have an axe to grind. And now it's time to promote myself again. And in this case, myself and my partner, Chance Gardner, and our quite spectacular DVD series, Magical Egypt, A Symbolist Tour.
PhoenixFire.
Magical Egypt, a symbolist tour in DVD, and more besides. If you can't take a trip to Egypt and experience it firsthand, well, you can't. Not everyone can, but next best and the closest you can get to experiencing Egypt is our 8-episode documentary series, Magical Egypt, a Symbolist Tour. This is the brainchild of my partner, Chance Gardner, a graphic designer and 3D animator of genius, and this series is an absolutely unique visual, emotional, and intellectual media experience. There are innumerable documentaries about Egypt, dry as dust, misleading, repetitive exercises in Egyptological establishmentarianism, from the National Geographic or Discovery Channel, or some other wielder of the academic cookie cutter. Pretty pictures, Nothing ever that feeds the mind, the heart, to say nothing of the soul. This series fills that gap. We explore Egypt in depth. We follow the ramifications into alchemy, the tarot deck, modern DNA research, sacred geometry, the mysteries of ancient technology. There are interviews with leading-edge scholars, scientists, and thinkers, each contributing to a radical revision of our understanding of the past. For more information, go to www.magicalegypt.com and more. If you've not read My Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, maybe it's time you did. An in-depth introduction to Shwala Dlubich's symbolist interpretation. Our Emmy Award-winning classic documentary, Mystery of the Sphinx, now available in an upgraded DVD version. My guidebook, The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, an invaluable source of information for armchair and actual travelers to Egypt. I have a few copies of my out-of-print first non-fiction book, The Case for Astrology, left for sale. See my website, www.jawest.net. Click on books.
PhoenixFire.
Magical Egypt, the Symbolist Tour, is not yet up on my website for sale, but I do sell them personally, and if you go to the website, www.jawest.net, you'll find my email address and also my mailing address, JAWSphinx, SPHINX, at AOL.com. I can get a set to you. It's $150 for the set of 8, a bargain at the price. So back to where we left off, Ernest G. McLean and his book, The Pythagorean Plato, Prelude to the Song Itself. McLean's main thesis, simple thesis, that all Plato's political dialogues are intended as musical allegories and do not in any way reflect history itself. I know from a tremendous amount of research, I have a kind of informed intuition. That intuition tells me that McLean is on to something absolutely serious and probably correct. If he is, then the whole search for Atlantis has to go off in a different direction. My sense of all of this, my informed intuition, tells me the musicology, McLean's musicology, cannot be wrong. Now, does this mean that there is no historical validity to the Atlantis legend? I understand that McLean believes this is the case. A mutual friend way back when got talking with me about this book and assured me that McLean had absolutely no use for anything or anyone that tried to claim some sort of historical or historicity, valid historicity, to the Atlantis legend. As far as I'm concerned, our Sphinx theory, until or unless disproved, means that there is some sort of historical validity to the legend after all. The crux of the matter is, of course, it's not just the Sphinx, but actually there's, without it being necessarily Atlantis, there's a lot of evidence out there now gathered over the last couple of decades for advanced knowledge in very, very ancient societies and in places among traditional people, so-called primitive people who have cosmologies that are expressed symbolically and mythically, but that resonate with or are consonant with or virtually identical to the latest wrinkles in torsion and string theory and quantum mechanics and that sort of thing. So there's plenty of evidence when you put it all together that highly sophisticated and advanced knowledge existed in the very, very distant past. But then the question arises, why is McLean's work effectively unknown? And one reason is fairly obvious, it's not easy. The other reason is that for a whole, let's say a whole spectrum of Atlantis hunters, they don't want to know. But also, because the book is so little known, received so little attention, in all likelihood, they don't know about it. Part of the reason why they don't know about it is actually my fault. Mea culpa. I know about this book, and I've known about it shortly after it was published. I don't remember how I got to know about it. It's published, I think, in 78 or 79. I think it's still in print. Any among you who want to read it for yourselves, Google it up. I think you will find it still in print. As I said, it ain't easy, and it's not, unless you're a musicologist, it's almost not interesting. It's just very, very important. I don't know why, oddly enough, I don't know why I never said anything about it. I think, and I was never trying to hide anything, because as I said earlier, from the get-go, I was putting Atlantis between inverted quotes. In other words, yes, there was a lost civilization. No, it was not necessarily buried at the bottom of the sea. It was not necessarily the case that Plato was fabricating his Atlantis legend. But I think I had The Serpent written for its first edition before I read MacLean, and then after that, on a number of occasions, 2 or 3 anyway, when Serpent in the Sky went back into print and I added appendices, I just didn't think of it. The Serpent in the Sky is hardly, in terms of sales, the Da Vinci Code. Too bad, too. You know, it's out there, and it's around, and people know about it, and probably had I an appendix to his work and the role that it plays in Atlantology and in chasing down Atlantis, it would probably be a lot better known than it is. This little radio program may help, and one of these days when Serpent is up for another reprinting, I will do an appendix that brings it to the attention of a bigger public than it has now. It would seem to mean, actually MacLean thinks it means, that all of the Atlantis hunters are completely deluded and should just stop. They should abandon their scuba gear and their excavation equipment. But actually, that's not necessarily the case. As I said earlier, from my point of view, the geology of the Sphinx proves categorically that there is historical truth involved, to the extent that a civilization capable of producing the most spectacular sculpture on Earth, and the temples around it that involve a technology so advanced that at present we couldn't even reproduce those temples. Probably we could if we put our minds to it. We could fly to the moon. We could figure out a way to get those blocks into place. But at the moment we can't do it. So that in and of itself demonstrates the existence, as I said, with plenty of corroborative evidence to hand nowadays, proves the existence that there was indeed an advanced civilization that disappeared, probably under cataclysmic circumstances in the very, very distant past. In answer to the question, was there an Atlantis? Yes, almost certainly there was, but it's not the Atlantis that anybody expects. And if anybody asked for my opinion or advice and wanted to go hunting for Atlantis, my first bit of advice would be read MacLean and continue on from there. To sum it up in a few words or a few paragraphs, when reading MacLean, it's well to bear in mind that he is almost certainly correct when he says that the Atlantis story, as it comes down to us from Plato, is intended as a musical allegory, and the quotes that we've heard from MacLean reinforce that point of view. And MacLean himself actually references older civilizations. He's not talking about an Atlantean civilization per se in the way that modern Atlantologists are thinking. In other words, he's talking about the civilizations of Egypt and Mesoamerica and possibly India, where an advanced musical knowledge was in place and was very important to those civilizations. He apparently denies that there's any historicity whatsoever to the Atlantis story. But my own conviction is, of course, that there is, and that the water weathering of the Sphinx and many other pieces of evidence that back this up, that highly advanced knowledge existed in the very, very distant past, and that this disappeared, or that civilization or civilizations disappeared probably under cataclysmic conditions. So you might say that MacLean is both right and wrong. He's right about his musical allegory, and therefore probably a mistake for Atlantologists to go even diving, or doesn't mean that they shouldn't keep on diving or throw away their excavating tools, because they are finding all sorts of things under the ocean and off the coast of Spain and so on. But these don't, and almost certainly won't, correspond to Plato's story. That said, I feel that the chances are that Plato himself is not lying or inventing the the bare bones of the Atlantis story. In other words, it probably does come to him, as stated, from his grandfather Solon, who, as stated, or as told to Plato, got it from an Egyptian priest. The peculiar thing is that in Egypt, as far as anyone knows, there are hints of cataclysmic of civilizations that disappeared. There's a Sekhmet myth that talks about the end of an era and so on and so forth. But probably no more detail came to Plato from Solon, and especially when you go back, look at McLean, and you see the terrific detail that Plato puts into the Atlantis myth. There are this many moats and this many bridges and everything is detailed in terms of it's 100 stads wide and 1,000 stads long and so forth and so on. That almost certainly isn't conveyed to him from Solon, or conveyed to Solon from an Egyptian priest. How would they know that kind of, how would they have that kind of information? And when it's all decoded musically, it all checks out. The numbers all jibe. And so as musical allegory, Atlantis stands. However, as I said, the Sphinx theory and many other pieces of evidence pretty much compel the belief that a much older civilization did exist. In other words, there's an Atlantis, but it's between quotation marks and probably not at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean or up on the Bolivian Altiplano or anything of that sort. So it complicates, but does not necessarily obviate the, let's say, the quest to find Atlantis. It just has to be remembered that it's a condition. It's a possibly global civilization and not in any one particular place. So Atlantologists, carry on. This is a section of Plato's description of Atlantis. This particular section in McLean is called the Islands of Atlantis, and it's Plato speaking here. Now, from Atlas sprang a prolific and illustrious house, which retained the throne for many generations. They possessed wealth such as had never been amassed by any royal line before them. Though their empire brought them a great external revenue, it was the island itself which furnished the main provision for all purposes of life. It also bore in its forests a generous supply of all timbers serviceable to the carpenter and builder, and maintained a sufficiency of animals, wild and domesticated. Even elephants were plentiful. There was ample pasture for this largest and most voracious of brutes. So the kings employed all these gifts of the soil to construct and beautify their temples, royal residences, harbors, docks, and domain in general on the following plan. They first bridged the rings of sea around their original homes, thus making themselves a road from and to their palace. They began on the seaside by cutting a canal to the outermost ring, 50 stadia long, 300 feet broad, and 100 feet deep. The ring could now be entered from the sea by this canal-like port, as the opening they had made would admit the largest of vessels. Further, at these bridges they made openings in the rings of land which separated those of water, just sufficient to admit the passage of a single trireme, covering the openings in so that the voyage through them became subterranean, for the banks of the rings of earth were considerably elevated above sea level. The breadth of the largest ring of water, that to which the canal from the sea had been made, was 3 stadia and a half, and that of the contiguous ring of land the same. Of the second pair, the ring of water had a breadth of 2 stadia, and that of land was once more equal in breadth to the water outside it. The land which had immediately surrounded the central islet was in breadth 1 stadium. The islet on which the palace stood had a diameter of 5 stadia. So they enclosed this islet with the rings and bridge, which had a breadth of 100 feet completely by a stone wall, building towers and gates on the bridges at either end of such passage for the seawater. Within the Acropolis was the palace with the following design. In the very center, surrounded by a golden railing, which it was forbidden to enter, was an untrodden sanctuary sacred to Clito and Poseidon. The very place where the race of the 10 princes had first conceived and begotten. Here, too, the seasonable offerings were made yearly to each of them from all of the 10 lots. Poseidon himself had a temple, a stadium long and half a stadium broad, with a proportionate height, but something un-Hellenic in its aspect. It contained golden statues of the god standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, and on such a scale that his head touched the roof, and of 100 nereids around him, riding on dolphins. Uses were found for the waters of the 2 springs, the cold and the warm. The supply from both was copious, and the natural flavor and virtues of their waters remarkable. When one had passed 3 outer harbors, a wall ran all round, starting at the sea, at a uniform distance of 50 stadia from the greatest ring, at its harbor, returning on itself at the mouth of the canal from the sea. This wall was completely filled by a multitude of closely set houses, and the large harbor and canal were constantly crowded by merchant vessels and their passengers arriving from all quarters, whose vast numbers occasioned incessant shouting, clamor, and general uproar, day and night. So that's part of the description of Atlantis. Now it's me talking. And if you stop for a second and think about this, and imagine that this kind of detail went from a nameless Egyptian priest to Solon, and then down to Plato, all of a sudden you have to stop and think, well, wait a minute now. How do they keep all that stuff in their head? We've lost the art of memory, but they had it to a certain extent. But it doesn't, it suddenly, the alarm bell should go on after a passage like that, saying, wait a minute, is there some ulterior motive or meaning to this?
Show notes available at www.jawpenixfire.blogspot.com.
PhoenixFire.
Production by Geraint Hughes, www.thepodule.com. More information on John Anthony West is available at www.jawest.net.